3. The experience of the eternal return. Correspondence. To Gast, Sils Maria, 14th August 1881. The August sun is overhead, the year is slipping away, the mountains and forests are becoming more quiet and peaceful. On my horizon, thoughts have arisen such as I have never seen before. I will not speak of them, but will maintain my unshakable calm. I suppose now I'll have to live a few years longer. Ah, my friend, sometimes the idea runs through my head that I am living an extremely dangerous life, for I am one of those machines which can explode. The intensity of my feelings makes me shudder and laugh. Several times I have been unable to leave my room for the ridiculous reason that my eyes were inflamed. From what? On each occasion I had wept too much on my wanderings the day before. Not sentimental tears, mind you, but tears of joy. I sang and talked nonsense, filled with a glimpse of things which put me in advance of all other men. After all, if I were unable to derive my strength from myself, if I had to wait for encouragement, comfort, and good cheer from the outside, where would I be? What would I be? There have indeed been moments, and even whole periods in my life, for example, the year 1878, when I would have felt a word of encouragement, a friendly handshake, to be the last word in restoratives. And precisely then everyone left me in the lurch, everyone on whom I thought I could rely, and who could have done me the favor. Now I no longer expect it, and feel only a certain dim and dreary astonishment when, for example, I think of the letters that reach me nowadays. They are all so insignificant. Nobody has come to experience anything because of me. Nobody has had a thought about me. What people say is very decent and well-intentioned, but it is remote, remote, remote. Even our dear Jacob Burckhardt wrote such a meek and timid little letter. Forgetting an anamnesis in the lived experience of the eternal return of the same. The thought of the eternal return of the same came to Nietzsche as an abrupt awakening in the midst of a Stimmung, a certain tonality of the soul. Initially confused with this Stimmung, it gradually emerged as a thought. Nonetheless, it preserved the character of a revelation, as a sudden unveiling. The ecstatic character of this experience must be distinguished from the notion of the universal ring that already haunted Nietzsche during the Hellenic period of his youth. But what is the function of forgetting in this revelation? More specifically, is not forgetting the source as well as the indispensable condition, not only for the revelation of the eternal return, but also for the sudden transformation of the identity of the person to whom it is revealed? Forgetting thus conceals eternal becoming and the absorption of all identities in being. Is there not an antinomy, implicit in Nietzsche's lived experience, between the revealed content and the teaching of this content, as an ethical doctrine, in the formula, act as though you had to relive your life innumerable times, and will to relive it innumerable times, for in one way or another you must recommence and relive it? The imperative proposition supplements the necessary forgetting by invoking the will to power. The second proposition foresees the necessity concealed in this forgetting. Anamnesis coincides with the revelation of the return. How could the return not bring back forgetfulness? Not only do I learn that I, Nietzsche, have been brought back to the crucial moment in which the eternity of the Cercle culminates, the moment in which the truth of its necessary return is revealed to me, but at the same time I learn that I was other than I am now, for having forgotten this truth, and thus that I have become another by learning it. Will I change again, and once more forget that I will necessarily change during an eternity, until I relearn this revelation anew? The emphasis must be placed on the loss of a given identity, the death of God. The God who guarantees the identity of the responsible self opens up the soul to all its possible identities, already apprehended in the various Stimmungen of the Nietzschean soul. The revelation of the eternal return brings about, as necessity, the successive realizations of all possible identities. At bottom, every name of history is I. In the end, Dionysus and the crucified. In Nietzsche, the death of God corresponds to a Stimmung in the same way as does the ecstatic moment of the eternal return. Digression. The eternal return is a necessity that must be willed. Only he who I am now can will the necessity of my return and all the events that have led to what I am, insofar as the will here presupposes a subject. Now this subject is no longer able to will itself as it has been up to now, but wills all prior possibilities. For by embracing in a single glance the necessity of the return as a universal law, I deactualize my present self in order to will myself in all the other selves whose entire series must be passed through, so that, in accordance with the circular movement, I once again become what I am at the moment I discover the law of the eternal return. At the moment the eternal return is revealed to me, I cease to be myself. Hic et nunc I am susceptible to becoming innumerable others, knowing that I shall forget this revelation once I am outside the memory of myself. This forgetting forms the object of my present willing, for such a forgetting would amount to a memory outside my own limits, and my present consciousness will be established only in the forgetting of my other possible identities. What is this memory? It is the necessary circular movement to which I abandon myself, freeing myself from myself. If I now admit to this willing, and by willing it necessarily I will have re-willed it, I will simply have made my consciousness conform to this circular movement. Were I to identify myself with the circle, I would never emerge from this representation as myself. In fact, already I am no longer in the moment when the abrupt revelation of the eternal return reached me. For this revelation to have a meaning, I would have to lose consciousness of myself, and the circular movement of the return would have to be merged with my unconscious, until the movement brings me back to the moment when the necessity of passing through the entire series of my possibilities was revealed to me. All that remains, then, is for me to re-will myself, no longer as the outcome of these prior possibilities, no longer as one realization among thousands, but as a fortuitous moment whose very fortuity implies the necessity of the integral return of the whole series. But to re-will oneself as a fortuitous moment is to renounce being oneself once and for all, for it is not once and for all that I had renounced being myself and had to will this renunciation, and I am not even this fortuitous moment once and for all, so long as I have to re-will this moment one more time. For nothing? For myself. Nothing here is the circle once and for all. It is a sign for everything that has happened, for everything that is happening, and for everything that will ever happen in the world. How can willing intervene without forgetting what must now be re-willed? For in fact, this very moment, in which the necessity of the circular movement was revealed to me, appears in my life as having never taken place beforehand. The hohe Stimmung, the high tonality of my soul, was required in order for me to know and feel the necessity that all things return. If I meditate on this high tonality in which the circle is suddenly reflected, and if I accept it, no longer as a personal obsession, but as the only valid apprehension of being, as the sole reality, I will see that it is impossible for it to have not already appeared to me innumerable times, perhaps in other forms. But I had forgotten it, because it is inscribed in the very essence of the circular movement, which I necessarily forgot from one state to the next, so that I can reach another state and be thrown outside of myself, even at the risk of everything coming to a stop. And even when I will not have forgotten that I had been precipitated outside myself in this life, I nevertheless had forgotten that I was thrown outside myself in another life, one in no way different from this life. At the risk of everything coming to a stop? Is this to say that the movement was stopped at the moment of the sudden revelation? Far from it. The movement was not stopped, for I myself, Nietzsche, was unable to escape it. This revelation did not come to me as a reminiscence, nor as an experience of déjà vu. Everything would stop for me if I remembered a previous identical revelation, even if I were continually to proclaim the necessity of the return, for it would serve to keep me within myself, and thus outside the truth that I am teaching. It was therefore necessary for me to forget this revelation in order for it to be true. Within the series that I suddenly glimpse, the series that I must live through in order to be brought back to the same point, the revelation of the eternal return of the same implies that the same revelation could just as well have occurred at any other moment of the circular movement. Indeed, it must be thus, for in order to receive this revelation, I am nothing except this capacity to receive this revelation at all the other moments of the circular movement. Nowhere in particular for me alone, but always in the movement as a whole. Nietzsche speaks of the eternal return of the same as the supreme thought, but also as the supreme feeling, as the highest feeling. Hence, in an unpublished note contemporaneous with the gay science, he writes, "My doctrine teaches, live in such a way that you must desire to live again. This is your duty. You will live again in any case. He for whom striving procures the highest feeling, let him strive. He for whom repose procures the highest feeling, let him rest. He for whom belonging, following, and obeying procures the highest feeling, let him obey, provided that he becomes aware of what procures the highest feeling, and that he shrinks back from nothing. Eternity depends upon it." And earlier he had noted that present humanity no longer knows how to wait, as nature is endowed with an eternal soul, fit for an eternal becoming and a future amelioration, are able to do. Here the emphasis is placed less on willing than on desire and necessity, and this desire and this necessity are themselves linked to eternity, whence the reference to the highest feeling, or, in Nietzschean terms, to the hohe Stimmung, the high tonality of the soul. It was in such a high tonality of the soul, such a Stimmung, that Nietzsche experienced the moment when the eternal return was revealed to him. How can a tonality of the soul, a Stimmung, become a thought? And how can the highest feeling, the höchste Gefühl, namely the eternal return, become the supreme thought? 1. The tonality of the soul is a fluctuation of intensity. 2. In order for it to be communicable, the intensity must take itself as an object and thus turn back on itself. 3. In turning back on itself, the intensity interprets itself. But how can it interpret itself? By becoming a counterweight to itself. For this, the intensity must divide, separate from itself, and come back together. Now this is what happens to the intensity in what could be called moments of rise and fall. However, it is always the same fluctuation, a wave, and in the concrete sense. We might note in passing the importance of the spectacle of sea waves in Nietzsche's contemplations. 4. But does an interpretation presuppose the search for a signification? Rise and fall, these are designations and nothing else. Is there any signification beyond this observation of a rise and fall? Intensity never has any meaning other than that of being an intensity. In itself, the intensity seems to have no meaning. What is a meaning? And how can it be constituted? What is the agent of meaning? 5. The agent of meaning, and thus of signification, once again seems to be the intensity, depending on its various fluctuations. If intensity by itself has no meaning other than that of being an intensity, how can it be the agent of signification, or be signified as this or that tonality of the soul? We asked above how it could interpret itself, and we answered that in its risings and fallings it had to act as a counterweight. But this was nothing more than a simple observation. How then does it acquire a meaning, and how is meaning constituted in the intensity? Precisely by turning back on itself, even in a new fluctuation. By turning back on itself, by repeating, and, as it were, imitating itself, it becomes a sign. 6. But a sign is first of all the trace of a fluctuation of intensity. If a sign retains its meaning, it is because the degree of intensity coincides with it. It signifies only through a new afflux of intensity, which in a certain manner joins up with its first trace. 7. But a sign is not only the trace of a fluctuation. It can also mark an absence of intensity, and here too a new afflux is necessary, if only to signify this absence. Whether we name this afflux attention, will, or memory, and whether we name this reflux indifference, relaxation, or forgetting, it is always a question of the same intensity, no different from the moving waves of the incoming tide. You and I, Nietzsche said to them, we are of the same origin, the same race. This flux and this reflux will intermingle, fluctuation within fluctuation, like the figures that rise to the crest of a wave, leaving behind them only foamy froth. Such are the designations through which the intensity signifies itself, and this is what we call thought. But if, in natures as apparently limited and closed as our own, there still exists something open enough to make Nietzsche invoke the movement of waves, it is because, notwithstanding the sign in which the fluctuation of intensity culminates, the signification, because it exists only through an afflux, can never absolutely disengage itself from the moving chasms it masks. Every signification remains a function of chaos, out of which meaning is generated. Intensity is subject to a moving chaos without beginning or end. Thus, in each person, apparently as their own possession, there moves an intensity, its flux and reflux forming significant or insignificant fluctuations of a thought that in fact belongs to no one, with neither beginning nor end. But if, contrary to this undulating element, each of us forms a closed and apparently delimited whole, it is by virtue of these traces of signifying fluctuations. That is to say, a system of signs that I will here call the code of everyday signs. As to where our own fluctuations start or stop, so that the signs can permit us to signify, to speak to ourselves and others, we know nothing, except that there is one sign in this code that always corresponds to either the highest or lowest degree of intensity, namely the self, the I, the subject of all our propositions. It is thanks to this sign, which nonetheless is nothing but an always variable trace of a fluctuation, that we constitute ourselves as thinking, that a thought as such occurs to us, even though we are never quite sure if it is not others who are thinking and continue to think in us. But what is this other that forms the outside in relation to this inside we believe ourselves to be? Everything is led back to a single discourse, namely, to fluctuations of intensity that correspond to the thought of every one and no one. The sign of the self in the code of everyday communication, insofar as it corresponds to the strongest or weakest intensity, and establishes a correspondence between our own degrees of presence or absence, and the degrees of presence and absence of the outside, thus assures a variable state of coherence both within ourselves and with our surroundings. The thought of no one, this intensity in itself, without any determinable beginning or end, finds a necessity in the agent, suppo, that appropriates it for itself, and is assigned a destiny within the vicissitudes of memory and the forgetting of itself or the world. Nothing could be more arbitrary, once we admit that everything is on a single circuit of intensity. For a designation to be produced, for a meaning to be constituted, my will must intervene. But again, this is nothing more than this appropriated intensity. Now, in a Stimmung, in a tonality that I will designate as the highest feeling, and that I will aspire to maintain as the highest thought, what has happened? Have I not surpassed my own limits, and thereby depreciated the everyday code of signs, either because thought abandons me, or else because I can no longer discern the difference between fluctuations from without and those from within? Up to now, in the everyday context, thought was always referred back to me in the designation myself. But what becomes of my own coherence at that degree of intensity, where thought ceases to refer back to me in the designation myself, and instead invents a sign by which it would designate its own coherence with itself? If this sign is no longer my own thought, does it not signify my exclusion from all possible coherence? If it is still mine, how could it conceivably designate an absence of intensity at the highest degree of intensity? Let us now suppose that during such a high tonality of the soul, an image of the circle is formed. Something happens to my thought in this sign. It regards itself as dead, as no longer my own. My thought enters into such a strict coherence with it that the invention of this sign, of the circle, takes on the power of all thought. Does this mean that the thinking subject would lose its own identity in a coherent thought that would itself exclude identity? There is nothing here to distinguish the designating intensity from the designated intensity, to re-establish the coherence between the self and the world, as constituted by everyday designations. A single circuit brings me back to the code of everyday signs, and then makes me depart, again leaving me at the mercy of the sign, as soon as I try to explain to myself the event it represents. For if, in this ineffable moment, I hear myself say, "You are returning to this moment. You have already returned to it. You will return to it innumerable times." No matter how coherent this proposition may seem to be in terms of the sign of the circle from which it is derived, for it is itself this very proposition, as an actual self in the context of everyday signs, I myself fall into incoherence. And this is a double manner, in relation to the coherence of this thought itself, and in relation to the code of everyday signs. According to the latter, I can only will myself once and for all, and it is on this basis that all my designations and their communicable meaning are constituted. But to re-will myself one more time indicates that nothing ever succeeds in getting constituted in a single meaning, once and for all. The circle opens me to inanity, and encloses me in the following alternative. Either everything returns, because nothing has ever had any meaning whatsoever, or else nothing has ever had a meaning except through the return of all things without beginning or end. Here is a sign in which I myself am nothing, a sign to which I always return for nothing. What is my part in this circular movement, in relation to which I am incoherent, or in relation to this thought that is so perfectly coherent that it excludes me at the very moment I think it? What is this sign of the circle that empties every designation of its content for the sake of this sign? The high tonality of the soul becomes the highest thought only by restoring the intensity to itself, by integrating the chaos from which it emanates with the sign of the circle which it has formed. The circle says nothing through itself, except that existence has meaning only in being existence, and that signification is nothing but an intensity. This is why the intensity is revealed in a high tonality of the soul. But how can intensity attack the actuality of the self, this self that is nonetheless elated by this high tonality? By liberating the fluctuations that were signifying it as a self, in such a manner that it is the past that rings out anew in its present. It is not the fact of being there that fascinates Nietzsche in this moment, but the fact of returning in what becomes. This necessity, which was lived and must be relived, defies the will and the creation of a meaning. In the circle, the will dies by contemplating this returning within becoming, and is reborn only in the discordance outside the circle. Whence the constraint exercised by the highest feeling. These high Nietzschean tonalities found their immediate expression in the aphoristic form. Even there, the recourse to the code of everyday signs is presented as an exercise in continually maintaining oneself in a discontinuity with respect to everyday continuity. When these Stimmungen blossom into fabulous physiognomies, it seems as if the flux and reflux of contemplative intensity seek to create points of reference for its own discontinuity. So many high tonalities, so many gods, until the universe appears as a dance of the gods, the universe being nothing but a perpetual flight from itself, and a perpetual refinding of itself in multiple gods. This dance of gods pursuing each other is still only an explication, in Zarathustra's mythic vision, of this movement of flux and reflux of the intensity of Nietzsche's Stimmungen, the highest of which came to him under the sign of the Circulus Vitiosus Deus. The Circulus Vitiosus Deus is merely a name for this sign, which here takes on a divine physiognomy under the aspect of Dionysus. Nietzsche's thought breathes more freely in the air of a divine and fabulous physiognomy than when it struggles internally against itself, as if in a snare where his own truth is trapped. Does he not say that the true essence of things is a fabulation of being that represents things, and without which being could not be represented at all? The high tonality of the soul, in which Nietzsche experienced the vertigo of eternal return, created the sign of this vicious circle. What was instantaneously actualized in this sign was both the highest intensity of thought, self-enclosed in its own coherence, and the absence of any corresponding intensity in the everyday designations. By the same token, the designation of the self, to which everything had heretofore led, was itself emptied. For in effect, with the sign of the vicious circle, as the definition of the eternal return of the same, a sign befalls Nietzsche's thought as an event that stands for everything that can ever happen, for everything that has ever happened, for everything that could ever happen in the world, and indeed in thought itself. The elaboration of the experience of the eternal return as communicable thought. The very first version Nietzsche gives, in The Gay Science, aphorism 341, of his Sils Maria experience, like those presented later in Zarathustra, is essentially expressed as a hallucination. At that very moment, the moment itself seems to be reflected in a flash, échappé, of mirrors. It is the self, the same self that awakens to an infinite multiplication of itself and its own life, while a kind of demon, like a genie in the 1001 Nights, reveals to it, "You will have to live this life once more, and innumerable times more." The reflection that follows declares, "If this thought gained possession of you, it would make of you an other." There is no doubt that Nietzsche is here speaking of a return of the identical self. This is the obscure point that was the stumbling block both to his contemporaries and to posterity. From the outset, this thought was commonly considered to be an absurd phantasm. Zarathustra considers the will as being enslaved to the irreversibility of time. This is the first reflective reaction to the obsessional evidence. Nietzsche therefore seeks to grasp the hallucination once more at the level of conscious willing through an analytic cure of the will. What is the relationship of the will to three-dimensional time, past, present, future? The will projects its powerlessness on time, and in this way gives time its irreversible character. The will cannot reverse the flow of time, the non-willed that time establishes as an accomplished fact. This produces, in the will, the spirit of revenge against the unchangeable, and a belief in the punitive aspect of existence. Zarathustra's remedy is to re-will the non-willed, inasmuch as he desires to assume the accomplished fact himself, thereby rendering it unaccomplished by re-willing it innumerable times. Such a ruse removes the once-and-for-all character from the event. This is the subterfuge that the experience of Sils Maria, which is in itself unintelligible, first offers to reflection. This reflection consequently hinges on willing. Such a ruse, however, is only one way of eluding the temptation inherent in the very reflection on the eternal return. Non-action, which Zarathustra rejects as a fallacious remedy, nonetheless implies the same inversion of time. If all things return, according to the law of the vicious circle, then all voluntary action is equivalent to a real non-action, or all conscious non-action is equivalent to an illusory action. At the level of conscious decision, not to act corresponds to the inanity of the individual will. It expresses the intensity of the high tonality of the soul as much as does the decision to pursue an action. How could the re-willing of the past be creative? To adhere to the return is also to admit that only forgetting enabled us to undertake old creations as new creations ad infinitum. Formulated at the level of the conscious self, identical to itself, the imperative of re-willing would remain a tautology. For it seems that this imperative, even though it demands a decision for eternity, concerns the will's behavior only during the interval of an individual life, and that the past, the non-willed, the riddle of dreadful chance, is what we live through every day. Now, this tautology is represented both in the sign of the circle and in Nietzsche's own thought by the return of all things, including itself. The parable of two opposed paths coming together under the arch of a gateway on whose pediment is inscribed moment in Zarathustra simply takes up the image of the aphorism in the gay science. The same moonlight, the same spider, will return. The two opposed paths are one, but an eternity separates them. Individuals, things, events go up one path and come down the other, and return as the same under the gateway of the moment, having made a tour of eternity. Whoever stops in this gateway is alone capable of grasping the circular structure of eternal time. But here, as in the aphorism, it is still the individual self who leaves and returns, identical to itself. Certainly, there is a link between this parable and the will's cure through a re-willing of the past, except that it does not carry any conviction. Yet the aphorism declares, in re-willing, the self changes, it becomes other. This is where the solution to the riddle lies. Zarathustra is seeking a change, not in the individual, but in its will, to re-will the non-willed past. This is what the will to power would consist in. But Nietzsche himself dreams of a completely different kind of change, a change in individual behavior. The re-willing of the past, if it is only an assumption of the non-willed by the will, as a creative recuperation, in the sense that fragment and riddle and dreadful chance are reconstituted in a significant unity, nonetheless remains at the level of a voluntarist fatalism. The change in the individual's moral behavior is not determined by the conscious will, but rather by the economy of the eternal return itself. Under the sign of the vicious circle, it is the nature of existence itself, independent of the human will, and hence individual actions as well, that is intrinsically modified. As Nietzsche says in a note, as revealing as it is brief, my consummation of fatalism, 1, through the eternal return and pre-existence, 2, through the liquidation of the concept of will. A fragment from Sils Maria, dated August 1881, states, the incessant metamorphosis. In a brief interval of time, you must pass through several individual states. Incessant combat is the means. What is this brief interval? Not just any moment of our existence, but the eternity that separates one existence from another. This indicates that the re-willing has, as its object, a multiple alterity inscribed within an individual. If this is the incessant metamorphosis, it explains why Nietzsche states that pre-existence is a necessary condition for the being as such of an individual. The incessant combat would indicate that the adherent of the vicious circle must henceforth practice this multiple alterity. But this theme will be taken up later when Nietzsche envisions a theory of the fortuitous case. These fragments introduce many new elements for developing the thought of the vicious circle. It is no longer simply the will confronting an irreversible time, which, when cured of its representation of a punitive existence, breaks the chains of its captivity by re-willing the non-willed, and by recognizing itself in the reversibility of time as a will to power, and hence as a creative will. For these fragments also suggest a transfiguration of existence, which, because it has always been the circle, wills its own reversibility, to the point where it relieves the individual from the weight of its own acts once and for all. What is at first sight the most burdensome pronouncement, namely, the endless recommencement of the same acts and the same sufferings, now appears as redemption itself, once the soul realizes that it has already lived through other individualities and experiences, and thus is destined to live through even more, which deepen and enrich the only life that it knows. Hic et nunc. those that are prepared for the present life, and those that the latter is preparing for others remain totally unsuspected by consciousness. Re-willing is the pure adherence to the vicious circle. Re-willing the entire series one more time, re-willing all experiences and all one's acts, but not as mine. This possessive no longer has any meaning, nor does it represent a goal. Meaning and goal are liquidated by the circle. Whence Zarathustra's silence, his interrupted message. Unless it is a burst of laughter that conveys all of his own bitterness. At this point, Nietzsche will become divided in his own interpretation of the eternal return. The overman becomes the name of the subject of the will to power, both the meaning and the goal of the eternal return. The will to power is only a humanized term for the soul of the vicious circle, whereas the latter is a pure intensity without intention. On the other hand, the vicious circle, as eternal return, is presented as a chain of existences that forms the individuality of the doctrine's adherent, who knows that he is pre-existed otherwise than he now exists, and that he will yet exist differently from one eternity to another. In this way, Nietzsche introduces a renewed version of metempsychosis, the need for purification, and hence a culpability that must be expiated across successive existences before an initiate's soul can attain a pure state of innocence and be admitted into an immutable eternity. Such is the ancient schema that was transmitted to the Christian gnosis by the esoteric religions of India and Asia. But there is nothing of all this in Nietzsche, neither expiation, nor purification, nor immutable purity. Pre- and post-existence are always the surplus of the same present existence, according to the economy of the vicious circle. It presumes that an individuality's capacity could never exhaust the differentiated richness of single existence, that is to say, its affective potential. Metempsychosis represents the avatars of an immortal soul. Nietzsche himself says, "If only we could bear our immortality, that would be the supreme thing." Now, for Nietzsche, this immortality is not specifically individual. The eternal return suppresses enduring identities. Nietzsche urges the adherent of the vicious circle to accept the dissolution of his fortuitous soul in order to receive another, equally fortuitous. In turn, having passed through the entire series, this dissolved soul must itself return. That is, it must return to that degree of the soul's tonality in which the law of the circle was revealed to it. If the metamorphosis of the individual is the law of the vicious circle, how can it be willed? Suddenly the revelation of the circle becomes conscious. To remain in this consciousness, it is sufficient to live in conformity with the necessity of the circle, re-willing this same experience. The moment we become the one who is initiated into the secret of the vicious circle, presupposes that one has lived through all livable experiences. All the existences prior to this moment, which privileges one existence among millions, no less than all those existences that will follow, are necessary. To re-will all experiences, to re-will all possible acts, all possible joys and sufferings, this means that if such an act were accomplished now, if such an experience were now lived, it would have been necessary for one series to have preceded and for others to follow, not within the same individual, but in everything that belongs to the individual's own potential, so that one day it could find itself one more time. The difference between the eternal return and traditional fatalism. Nietzsche's thinking concerning fatalism culminates in the dimension of the circle. Fatalism in itself, the fatum, presupposes a chain of events, pre-established in a disposition, which is developed and realized in an irreversible manner. Whatever I do and whatever I decide to do, my decision, contrary to what I may think, obeys a project that escapes me and of which I am unaware. The vicious circle reintegrates the play of chance, with its million combinations as so many series forming a chain, into the experience of the fatum, in the form of a movement without beginning or end, an image of destiny which, as a circle, can be re-willed only because it must be recommenced. Chance is but one thing at each of the moments, the individual, singular, and hence fortuitous existences of which it is composed. It is by chance that the figure of the circle is revealed to an individual. From that moment on, the individual will know how to re-will the entire series in order to re-will itself. Or in other terms, as soon as the individual exists, it cannot fail to re-will all the prior and subsequent series of its own existence. The feeling of eternity and the eternalization of desire merge in a single moment. The representation of a prior life and an afterlife no longer concerns a beyond, or an individual self that would reach this beyond, but rather the same life lived and experienced through its individual differences. The eternal return is merely the mode of its deployment. The feeling of vertigo results from the once and for all, in which the subject is surprised by the dance of innumerable times. The once and for all disappears. The intensity emits a series of infinite vibrations of being, and it is these vibrations that project the individual self outside of itself as so many dissonances. Everything resounds until the consonance of this single moment is re-established, where the dissonances are once again resolved. At the level of consciousness, meaning and goal are lost. They are everywhere and nowhere in the vicious circle, since there is no point on the circle that cannot be both the beginning and end. Finally, the eternal return, at its inception, was not a representation, nor was it, strictly speaking, a postulate. It was a lived fact, and as a thought, it was a sudden thought. Phantasm or not, the experience of Sils Maria exercised its constraint as an ineluctable necessity. Alternating between dread and elation, Nietzsche's interpretations will be inspired by this moment, by this felt necessity. How Nietzschean fatalism culminates in the elimination of the concept of the will. Nietzsche does not say that the thought of the eternal return and the pre-existence it presupposes can itself bring fatalism to an end. He says, in the second place, that it is because the concept of the will has been eliminated that his fatalism is complete. If the thought of the eternal return in its various extensions already abolishes the identity of the self, along with the traditional concept of the will, then Nietzsche, under the second aspect of his fatalism, would seem to be alluding to his own physiology. According to the latter, there is no will that is not a will to power, and in this regard the will is nothing other than the primordial impulse. No moral interpretation by the intellect could ever suspend the innumerable metamorphoses this impulse lives through, the shapes it adopts, or the pretexts that provoke them, whether it be an invoked goal, or the meaning that this impulse, in its various metamorphoses, or even at the level of consciousness, claims to give itself. In this way, fatalism would be merged with the impulsive force that exceeds the agent's will and already modifies it, thereby threatening its stable identity.